Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session, Reparative Decision-Making Across Collections. My name is Sherri Berger. I'm acting head of archives and digital collections at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. I am a white woman with medium length brown hair, wearing a cobalt blue shirt, and I am in front of a yellow and purple tapestry in my home. Getting into the session here, as the title of this session suggests, this panel is not really about the technology or the mechanics of collections digitization, but rather it starts with the premise that our online collections are the result of a lot of choices that we make. And we make those choices at many different stages of the process, often long before or even long after the imaging process of digitization is done. So what we're doing is positing that a great digital collections infrastructure involves a lot more and a wider aperture, so to speak, than the specs that we use to do great image capture or lossless audio migration and all of that good stuff. Those things are important, obviously, but they're only part of our responsibilities for collection stewardship and access. To engage in these exciting questions, at least I think they're very exciting and challenging, I am joined by an esteemed panel of professionals. And here today, I'm going to introduce them briefly in alphabetical order. We have Dorothy Berry. Dorothy currently serves as the inaugural Digital Collections Program Manager at Houghton Library at Harvard University. Her work focuses on the discoverability of African American history in special collections through research, description, and digitization. We also have Ngaire Blankenberg. Ngaire is the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. Previously, she worked as a museum consultant for myriad projects and institutions on 5 continents. And as a result, she has worked with many different types of museums, from national to local, with all sorts of collections. And additionally, she has advised and lectured on related topics like integrating cultural spaces in cities and parks, making archives accessible, and decolonizing knowledge production. And finally, we also have Stacie Williams. Stacie is the inaugural division chief for archives and special collections at the Chicago Public Library. She is also a collaborator on many renowned local and national projects. For example, she is currently the chair of the Society of American Archivists Publications Board, and she is a member of the independent Blackivist Collective, which works to preserve Chicago area Black history. Stacie is also a former journalist and a writer whose work has appeared in many publications that I guarantee you have most certainly heard of. Due to time constraints, I have given exceptionally short shrift to the work of these individuals. I urge you to read through the Smithsonian Digitization Conference website and also their social media profiles and the various websites and the online presences that they maintain. It is truly, and I say this seriously, it is truly my honor to facilitate the discussion among the 3 of you today. A little bit of housekeeping for the folks that have joined us today. This is a completely discussion-based session, so there are not going to be any PowerPoint slides. It is all about the conversation and about exploring the theme of the topic as laid out. It's going to be kind of a half and half thing. I'm going to first pose 3 initial questions to all 3 of the panelists. And then for the second half, we're going to be opening it up to your questions as the attendees of the session. If you have a question, I would request that you put it in the Q&A panel, which is towards the bottom of the page. They are going to be sifted through and discussed between me and my colleague, Nathan Anderson from the Digitization Program Office at the Smithsonian. He's going to kind of beam them to me, and then I will direct them to our panelists, and we'll be able to answer them, hopefully as many as possible. I'd urge you to put questions in there early and often, as they say, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. There is also a chat feature in this program. You can also feel free to make use of that, but I would encourage you to use that more as conversation and reflection and musings on what is said here, and as a way to engage with the other participants and the other people who are viewing this program. And on that note, I would ask you to be respectful in that space, recognizing that this session in particular may present some challenging ideas and topics. So please use the chat box and the QA features responsibly. Without further ado, I will pose the first question to our panelists, and I will ask each of you to respond in the same order in which I introduce you. So first Dorothy, then Ngaire, and then Stacie. The first question that I have for you is, we have titled this session Reparative Decision-Making Across Collections. Why do you think decision-making is so central to the work of digitization and collections? What are some of the key decision points that you have encountered and that you prioritize in this work? And with that, I will hand it off to Dorothy.
Great, I'm so glad to be in conversation, and I will do my visual description, which is something I find challenging to be descriptive about my own self, but I would say I'm a very light-skinned African-American mixed race woman with dark hair. It's about 4B, but it's in a twist out, so it looks longer, like it's got a different texture, but it doesn't. Decision making is one of those things that it feels almost obvious. Of course it's important. We can't do anything without making decisions. Nothing happens just in a vacuum. But I think reparative decision making is so integral to how I think about work I produce, because we are building on legacies that need to be acknowledged and oftentimes transitioned. Very few folks are working in a brand new environment that has no history and has only, generative things coming from this present moment. And even then, your ideas would be generated from things that you learned. So your foundation, we're all working on foundations that either need to be reaffirmed or perhaps re-examined. And so for me, that decision making and the reparative decision making needs to begin with that acknowledgement, which I think is really difficult for a lot of our institutions, because there's something very positive in saying that we're doing new things that are more inclusive or more diverse, but we don't like to examine the implication of more, which implies that at some point it was less. And so I try in my projects to not only make decisions that I think reprioritize, and specifically for work that a lot of the work I do that reprioritizes Black history, but also trying to be as transparent as possible about why those decisions are made. A common complaint that I have experienced, and probably others have as well, from more peeved patrons, I'll say generously, is that it's not fair to focus so much on African American history when there are other types of history. And usually the implication, or the not implication, usually the flat out is there's also white history. And for me, the response for most of the institutions I've worked at is just, luckily we've spent the last 30 to 300 years focusing on non-Black history. So even if we do 200 years of big projects, we'd still be a little bit behind. But I think that transparency is really important to me, and the responsibility I think we have is project designers, and especially when we're creating digital content, there's a responsibility we have to researchers and of all types.
Thanks, Dorothy. I guess it's my turn now. My visual description is remarkably like Dorothy's, only she has big gold hoop earrings and I do not, but also light-skinned mixed race woman with, not sure what my curl pattern is today, but longish hair. I'm really glad that we're talking about decision-making, because for me, it's almost a stand-in for the issue of power. And as a director of an African art museum, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there is a lot of power associated with the decisions that we make, and that power is manifested through decision-making. I think a lot of the times with museums, we're almost seen, the knowledge that we create is almost seen as sort of normative and rationalist, like it's just obvious, there's a logic to it, and that we follow a certain element of professional standards, and things just happen. And I think by focusing on, the points at which decisions are made, it forces us to also acknowledge who is making those decisions, and what contexts are we making decisions, both in the past and in today. And so, as Dorothy said, when we talk about reparative decision-making, it's acknowledging that a set of decisions have been made in the past, and in the case of our museum, around what to collect, what to classify, how to document, what to photograph, how to photograph, what to digitize, what to distribute. There's a series of decisions that have been made in the past, that are made in the present, and that will continue to be made in the future by very different people in different contexts. And it's very important to make those transparent. So I think that when we look at decision-making, we draw attention to the decision-making. We also draw attention to the power that many of us have. You know, it's not just me as a director who makes decisions, but everybody in the course of their daily lives makes decisions. And if we focus on the decisions we make, I think it encourages greater self-reflection, criticality, and intentionality in the work that we do. And, you know, just to kick us off, I guess when you ask about the kind of decisions that I make or that we make at NAMAFA, they're incredibly broad. It starts perhaps with the allocation of resources, right? So how much money or time do we put into a particular activity, staffing and consultation, who's making decisions, with what level of authority, who do we consult with, how much time do we give to that consultation, what is the nature of research, what do we research, what provenance do we look at, what do we ignore, what do we decide to repatriate or to remain. We have decision-making around conservation protocols, how to conserve, when to conserve, for whom. And similarly with documentation, what to classify, what is the language that we use in terms of metadata, how do we make that accessible, and again, for whom. And I can go on and on, display and distribution, and I think finally also impact and measurement. We make decisions as to what we measure and what we consider to be success. And that is an indication of what we value in terms of how we allocate resources. So that's a beginning, but I think it's really important to do such decision-making within a reparative framework, as Dorothy mentioned. And I'm throwing it to Stacie.
Well, thank you, Ngaire and Dorothy. Honored to be following up behind you here. And, you know, I think, so visual description, just tried to think in my mind. Yes, I'm a medium brown skinned woman. I think Wu-Tang said the category was caramel sundae. Do with that what you will. Short faded hair, large glasses. So I'll say I like this question because, like Dorothy said, implied in the question is that it leans into sort of our contemporary theories around information management, which is that the work isn't neutral. We are all coming to it as individuals. We have these different biases, stereotypes, incorrect information, etc. So, you know, I think just the idea that we could acknowledge our subjective positioning through this question, I think is really, it's an important part of even beginning to talk about it. So I could say that I'm interested, I'm always interested in reparations, but even beyond the idea of economic repair to Black people in this country, I'm very interested in speaking the issues of repair across an organization. You know, thinking through like collections and facilities and people. And it's not so much that I'm trying to take this role as like judge and jury, but, you know, in these decision-making roles that we have the opportunity to can create the conditions for repair. You know, I think like both Dorothy and Ngaire, and this has been across all different types of institutions I've been in, you know, some decisions I think are going to be very necessarily about the repair of how the professional work was performed. So for instance, before I even arrived at my current institution, the archival staff had created a harmful like materials note, basically acknowledging that you know, there were former terms that had been created before on finding guides that were an issue, but it also leaves us, the blanket statement also leaves us, I think, room for evolution of language in the future. So it's not that it was, oh, here was a reactive decision made at the, you know, in a short-term way at the point of repair, but really, you know, really intentionally acknowledging that language is always going to change. We will always be evolving. We will always be coming into I think new and more nuanced ways of being and identifying ourselves. So why not simply acknowledge now that even what we're doing today might not have the kind of permanence that we think it will because there's always this new information. So, thinking through things like that, or, concrete ideas around repair, like collections budgets, or, thinking about like processing and directing digitization resources to, say, historically excluded collections or topics or communities. But of course, also thinking about approaching hiring. So I could say, as a senior staff member here in the library, I do have the responsibility of serving on committees where we're talking about hiring, we're talking about staffing, recruitment, retention. This is one of the largest public library systems in the country. So those issues and how we're trying to think through them in a deeply systemic way. Those are opportunities, I think, for repair, but it's also thinking about that deeper level. What does repair look like along staffing lines? In a 21st century public library system, but in a city like Chicago, which is very honestly still deeply segregated, how do you create repair in a system that does function in many ways around systemic oppression, and you can see those inequalities not just across the city, but we see them in our work in libraries. So, I think just thinking through what is our lane, what's our role of responsibility. Those are just some of the types of things that I think have come up in this idea around what it means to think with a reparative framework around all of the decision-making aspects that affect your collections.
Well, that is a natural bridge to the second question. And Dorothy and Ngaire will have an immediate ability to respond to Stacie some of your thoughts, because it goes straight into the second question that I've prepared for you all. How do each of you define the word reparative? And following up on some of Stacie's initial thoughts about this, what do you think is most in need of repair in the work here? And also I might ask, to what ends? How do each of you conceptualize that notion of reparative? Dorothy, if you could kick us off.
So I think in this context, repair is very situation specific. Obviously, I have like a broader definition of repair to fix things that are flawed or broken, but I think what that means is so discrete. So I couldn't say across the field of GLAMs, the most important thing to repair is anything, because each place, I guess if I really had to say it that broad, it would be labor practices, because that's the most core human level that is institutional. But when I'm thinking of individual places, everyone has their own history, and each institution has its own practices, which may need to be repaired from perhaps even just transitions in the field. So thinking of some of the things Stacie's bringing up of just standards changing, perceptions changing. And, this I think is a difficult thing when we're talking about repair, because a lot of places, if you have colleagues that have been in a place for 30 years, there have been transitions in perception over that time span. And so sometimes the repair work is on work that is currently, is done by folks that we're still working with. And so for me also, that brings up a definition of repair that is based on positive growth, and not overly based on some sort of like shame-based building process. I think a lot of reparative work from predominantly white institutions tends to focus on the individual growth process. And that individual growth process often leads to a continued centering of the same voices, because the idea is we want to change from our racist path and grow into a new thing. And this is something we need to do based on feelings and internal growth. And there's a strong place for that. But I think a lot of the workplace reparative work that is potentially more generative is bringing in potentially less traditionally professional ideas around working together. And so for me, reparative work that is so key, the impact all goes down to the user. whether that be a library patron or a researcher in a reading room or a guest in a museum just walking around with their kids. The question is, what am I delivering to these people? And that is my goal. And I think that there's also something that I would like to repair, but many people would say is not broken, is that sort of longer term idea that our institutions primarily exist for indefinite stewardship. And that indefinite stewardship means that potentially if what we're doing isn't serving the family that comes into the museum, that's not a net negative, because at the end of the day, at least we'll be able to have this for 500 years. And for me, I think that is something of a cop-out, but also is not necessarily culturally relevant to the types of materials we might be preserving. And I think that is, again, that sort of repair of thinking. How are we thinking about these models? Is our job to store things? Is our job to keep things safe? Is keeping things safe meaning they're not being used? Even if the use is the function of that object? And those sorts of things, to me, is that repairing of thought processes. Of course, at the core, though, stuff like fair wages, labor, that's the real repair. That would be great if we could get that done too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously echo a lot of what Dorothy says. I think for us, we talk about repair and we also talk about regeneration. And I think implied in the notion of repair is that harm is inflicted, that there is actual harm. And I think that's really important because a lot of museums are created through white supremacist and Eurocentric ideas. You know, they come out of the European Enlightenment. The measures of how we do things come with a certain set of assumptions around value and worldviews. And in and of themselves, those may not necessarily be bad, but what they do at the same time is they negate other people's worldviews and they negate other people's identities. And so harm is done through erasure, through obfuscation, through miscategorization, mischaracterization. And harm is done to creators of work, to source communities, and to potential audiences of work, you know, in the present and also in the future. And I think it's really important for us to really acknowledge that harm has been done and harm continues to be done, often in a systemic way, not necessarily in an interpersonal way, as Dorothy was talking about. And so in order to repair that harm, we have to take a hard look at what the underlying assumptions are around our work. And so repair means trying to stop harming, repair harm of the past, but stop doing it in the future and the present. And so when we talk about audiences or users of our work, it's also like, what are the assumptions we bring to that? You know, are we in you know, at our museum, I'm saying, you know, we're creating a museum that's of Africa and for global Africans. It's not necessarily about Africa, explaining or centering white audiences or audiences that feel no affinity towards the work. And so that conversation then shifts a little bit, which is, you know, what do our audiences, what do our knowledge seekers need from us, what do our artists and what do our creators need for us? And I mean, on the point that I know Stacie and Dorothy both talk about in terms of labor, for me, it's really important as an African art museum where we think of collections being cared for a lot of the times a lot better than people. So if we think that we're able to acquire collections from all over the world, but we can't necessarily hire people from all over the world to look after them. When we think of like modes of citizenship and rights of people and the labor force, et cetera, and we compare those to the values that we ascribe to our collections, often there's a disconnect. And so repair for me means that the creators of work, the creative process of works and the communities within which these work come, whether they're photographs or documents or 3D collections or whatever they are, those are valued as much as the materiality of the collection themselves. And it's very important that we shift that a little bit and that we don't think that our job here is to look after collections at any cost, at the expense of the context and the people who have created and who have a connection to those collections.
So defining reparative, I mean, yes, I think really reparative is about action or design that could lead to the repair. You know, repair, the word itself is more about the quality, or maybe suggests the quality of the approach. So when I'm thinking about it that way, you know, what's most in need of repair? Absolutely, I echo my peers here. When it's about labor, it's always been about labor, really. I mean, that truly feels like it's been the biggest question from, you know, for a very long time. How's the work getting done? You know, how do we pay the people to do the work necessary to preserve and make accessible all of this work? You know, and in what different ways can we do that? Do we have the decision-making power to advocate for, you know, digitization as part of your operating budget? You know, and thinking through what that saves in terms of time or resources if you're not necessarily having to apply for grants year after year to make work available. And then what that looks like in terms of the, you know, the capacity of your staff makes it, you know, makes a difference on who even your staff are. You know, I think for me, labor definitely in the role that we're currently in, it feels like a moment for repair, not just in the professional work that we're doing in our shop, but as one of the larger repositories in the city in terms of, you know, where are ways that we can think through with our local partners on collaborating more equitably around labor? What types of recommendations, you know, can we make, since we are a shop with full-time union staff? Like, how can we collectively help structure, you know, good jobs, good salaries for this work across, you know, across the region, or maybe even provide models for folks thinking this through in other places. Maybe it's simply thinking that Chicago's very special and unique role in American labor history, I think, keeps me thinking in a very specific way about what repair looks like in that very specific and I think immediate aspect of the field, and how we're thinking about collections. There's an opening. Who do you hire in that opening, and how do you write that job so that you're not just, you know, bringing in the candidates you need, but that you really are planting a seed and again, creating those conditions for repair, hiring people who understand that harm has been done and repair is needed in different ways.
I mean, can I jump in here? Because I think for me it is labor to a certain, definitely I hear you. Good jobs are really important, and who has those jobs is equally as important. But for me also, there is an element of professional practice, because I think even when you repair the conditions of labor, you're still set with legacies of inequitable professional practice. And it's not really about identity. You know, I think that, you know, Black people are not necessarily better at acknowledging identity, naming, or looking at conservation practice than white people, or Americans than Africans, or, you know, it's not necessarily endemic to the choices that we make. I think it certainly makes a big difference. But I think understanding what is professionalism within our organizations is also critically important, because in the work that I've done with museums around the world, that to me is often the biggest stumbling block to change, that people are heavily invested in their professional identities. They're proud of being a conservator, registrar, archivist, whatever. And that identity comes with a set of professional practices that often can run counter to efforts towards more inclusion, more equity, more community consultation, doing things a different way. And that's often where the resistance can also come in. So I think that the notion of labor and making sure that we have people who are hired to do this work, who are treated properly, who have good conditions, who have, you know, all the rest of it is really important. But then also I think how we do that work and how we define our identities vis-a-vis that work is equally as important to this notion of repair.
Before we move on to the third question, Dorothy or Stacie, do you wish to respond to Ngaire's comments?
I should think it's a really excellent point. So I will say a thing, maybe as just a concrete example, a thing that we did in our shop was once all 3 of the archival units came under one umbrella with the system-wide exhibits department. I altered the titles for the unit head. I mean, the title is the title can be whatever you created. There are categories that the union creates, but prior to that point, the unit heads within the archival units had all had this title of curator. We have actually an exhibits unit, and that's actually the place where the title seems most appropriate, in terms of, I think, pinpointing what Ngaire was talking about in terms of that identity and that titular identity, especially being so deeply intertwined in people's personal identity. There's an element of ego work too when we're making decisions, and we can, if we can acknowledge and just be real that ego work absolutely plays a role in how individuals make decisions at a certain level. I think looking at even little things that we can do to say, hey, here's where we could simply make that more equitable, remove maybe what would have simply been a prestige title out of a role that actually is more administrative or operational in nature. It's not that curation doesn't happen, but does curation happen so much at that level and in that role that's an appropriate title, or is it really like the more appropriate title for the person in an exhibits department? So yeah, I think that's such an excellent and great point. And I do think it's one of those things it's part of our profession, but also how we, I think, are maybe socialized to see ourselves in the world of work, that we are very tightly knitted to the work that we're doing, or it's very much a part of who we are. And I think part of this reparative conversation is about really challenging folks to interrogate that and reframe our relationships to the work that we're doing.
That's another wonderful transition to the final question. But before I go there, I do want to note that this is the last kind of pre-prepared question. So this is a really great time if, as a observer of this session, if you have been thinking about a question or you've been a little shy, or the time is now. So please put your question in the box, and then we will turn to your questions after this. I will also, this is a little bit on the spot for the panelists, but if you would like to ask questions of each other, I would also encourage you to jot something down as we go through this last round. I'll also give you a chance to open it up, and we can equally be both learners and instructors in this space. So the last question that I want to pose to each of you, again, we'll go Dorothy, then Ngaire, then Stacie, and we've actually started going there a little bit, is, recognizing that often in our institutions, many different people play these many different roles in digitization and collections management and collections access. Do you have any suggestions for those who are engaged in this work, but might not feel like they have, or just might not have point blank, right? The decision-making power, as Ngaire, you were alluding to earlier. And that could be due to a number of reasons, right? It could be due to the hierarchy of our organizations, possibly just simple buy-in, right? Or also just the division of labor across organizations that are working on all of these different fronts that we've been talking about. And I think that this panel has done such a beautiful job spanning all of the different functions that go into collections. So this becomes a real issue, right? So all these different people are working at all these different levels. What do you think are some strategies for people in all of these roles and levels, or perhaps one of these roles, to adopt reparative approaches in the manner that you all are suggesting? So Dorothy, again, we'll start with you.
For me, I think what's really important to me is not doing actions that I can't stand behind. I don't necessarily, I guess on paper and pretty much in practice, I don't have a lot of decision-making power at my institution. To the surprise of outsiders sometimes, because things that people think are part of my job, like reparative description, I have nothing to do with that at the whole university system. Nothing to do with it. Not on the reparative committees. Even when they cite my work, I find out later, like I'm not part of it. Digitization, I am in charge of workflows. Technically, I am not supposed to make any decisions about what gets done. On the flip side of that, though, I don't like to do things and be in contexts where I can't stand behind my work. And so, I mean, this is one of those things where I don't necessarily really like to make recommendations because everyone's experiences are so different and they'll be so context specific. But for me, I have made choices when I can to take the time and alter my own work in order to at least at all times be working on something that I think has a type of value. And sometimes that means extra work, which I don't really recommend. That's why it's context. You know, I'm not recommending anybody take on extra work. Everybody's already working a lot. But it can mean something like when I proposed that we refocus for a year on digitizing Black history materials. That was something that was not that we did not have a process for doing that sort of thing. It was truly just born out of being tired that we didn't do that work. And that also meant that was a ton of extra work on my end. And so part of me says, like, propose things or do things or find small things that have value to you. Because a lot of times there are big systems of approval and there are structures that stop us from doing things, but they don't necessarily stop us from doing them if they're already done. And it's a tricky thing. I don't need to tell everyone to be work rebels, but the sort of thing of something actually, I guess to me, the best way I'll say this, and then I'll move on because I'm clearly not particularly articulate on this, is if something is actively a problem that you recognize in your workplace in terms of something that you see needs repair. And I don't mean the fetching that we all do of like, wow, this administration totally needs repair. Or like, this managerial thing is a big problem and we need different people. Not the sort of things that are our everyday work problems. But if you are creating metadata for digital objects and you keep recognizing that this authorized heading that is particular to your subject area expertise is just off, and you know it's off because you work with this particular area, initiate some change. Even if there's like a whole process, you can take that on as a task you want to accomplish. And I know that there can be both managerial and internal things that stop people. I had a colleague once who was talking about who did Ethiopic cataloging and noticed that one of the other like 3 places that was doing Ethiopic cataloging was using incorrect, what's that term? Unicode. It didn't translate. And she was like, I don't know if can I just reach out to them? Should I talk to my manager? And I was like, your manager doesn't do this type of cataloging. Can your manager even say it? These people are your colleagues, even if you're like Stacie's getting, even if your job is like assistant cataloger central and their job is curator of, you know, Near Eastern and East African manuscript, you are colleagues, you do the same thing. And I think sometimes we get in our own ways on the things that are within our realm. So yeah, I guess that's how I think of it. I think of that psalm that says, I don't put my eye on things that are too large for me. Like, I'm not ever trying to fix something that's a Harvard library problem, but I might try to fix things that are within my purview or within what I see every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You know, as someone who's the director of the museum and who theoretically has quite a lot of decision-making power, I'm acutely aware of, in fact, how I can't operate alone. That I can make all the decisions I want, but we exist within a broader system that is made up of a whole bunch of people making a whole bunch of little decisions in their daily work. I, as one individual, neither have the expertise, the knowledge, nor the time to make every single decision, and not any person can do that. And that's why I guess I'm an expert in, I guess, museums, sort of, and institution building, and I am really fascinated by how systemic inequities perpetuate despite intention. And the reason that systemic inequities perpetuate is because they're hardwired into the system. And even though the system is people, those system is not one person. It's a whole bunch of people making a whole bunch of little decisions every day. And I think it's really dangerous when people, I guess, don't see the agency that they have within this system. because it means that there's not a lot of accountability, or there's not any kind of thought as to, okay, how am I, obviously inadvertently, perpetuating some of these issues? And I found in my work with museums and decolonization in all facets of museums that it is extremely rare that there's one sort of Eurocentric white supremacist or racist decision maker. There's just a whole bunch of little rules that somehow the net effect means that things stayed the same. And there's a lot of people who are heavily invested in maintaining that system for whatever reason, professional practice, for identity, for time, whatever. And so it's a lot easier to say that, like, okay, well, this isn't my decision. I don't have the power around this. But actually, I do think, I know that everybody has a certain amount of power. And the brilliant thing about museums, and I'm sure it's similar in libraries, is that they are by necessity an institution. You know, we're not an artist. We're not like, there are so many different pieces in the work that we do that no single person can do it on their own. And I notice when a single person in my team is absent or underperforming or performing exceptionally well, it changes so much. And so I guess, you know, that's such an important lesson for me, is that there is so much that people can do. Even that, you know, Dorothy, your examples were fantastic, but, you know, I talk about, like, I analyze all the little bits, right? Like photography of collections. How do we photograph collections? Like, is it from above? Is it from below? Is it from around? What is the lighting? I mean, you know, the photographer is just one part in the whole digitization process, but he or she makes decisions about that all the time. The metadata, the data, the field, the entry forms, all of that stuff. I mean, people who do that may seem to be, you know, one small cog in a big machine, but if that cog is clogged, everything, you know, comes to a standstill. You know, and so I do really, really believe that, of course, there is power, and people have commensurate power and positional power for which they need to be accountable, but everybody has a certain amount of power and a certain amount of agency within this broader system. And the only way we can change some of these systemic issues is everybody recognizes their role to play.
Absolutely. I totally agree. The idea of titular, or not titular, but situational power. We all have power. There's a lane in which we all operate, in which we, you know, hold power in any given situation, even if it looks on the surface like you do not have any. So I think the first thing about, you know, this type of repair or thinking through decision-making power is, it's important to understand, yes, what you can fix, what you cannot fix, what is in your lane. You know, thinking through, I definitely see where at the public library versus when I was in academia, you know, there is much more of an expectation. People will ask you as a public librarian, well, what do you think the public library can do to solve, you know, the crime in a city, or like you know, economic instability. And that's an area in which I'm like, wow, is that really the library's job to do all that? Or can we, you know, can we be sharing information as I thought was our initial charge, for sharing information? So I think understanding, yeah, you solely cannot take it on. You know, I think important to recognize with all of the DEI initiatives and the work and the jobs that, you know, demanding that people of color or folks who have been part of historically excluded groups come into an organization that has a history of being hostile and all of a sudden fix it just because they have that title, that titular representation. That's horribly unrealistic. I think the best thing that we can do, or just a thing I try to do, is just focus on creating the conditions. How do we create the conditions for folks to feel like, number one, if a mistake has been made and harm has been caused, you know, let people know that there's opportunities for repair. Can we create the conditions for just, you know, grace and forgiveness for one, and also help create the conditions to to eliminate that type of toxic culture that does, as Ngaire said, it's like the little decisions that all added up to things staying the same, of what's in our, what's in our decision-making lanes to try to change things like that. But then I think the other thing that you can do to create the conditions is just asking a lot of questions, honestly, asking a lot of questions, and then being there to really listen. So, a thing that I will ask folks at the end of new meetings is there anything that you wanted to mention that I didn't ask about? Because it presumes, I think, that there's more to share, and you need context in order to help create conditions for repair. You need as much information as possible. And so I think having a conversation sometimes about the same thing more than once has been very helpful for me, because it always reveals new information about that topic. And at least for me, it's hard to even think through what's a good idea or thought for repair if I don't have all the information. How can I make a decision about repair if I don't have all the information? So yeah, creating the conditions for people to feel like they can be listened to, and also creating the conditions for people to feel like there's room to make mistakes, because we're all human. We all make mistakes. We have all, made a decision and perhaps wish we could have made another one later. So how can we create the environment for people to still come to the table and say, I am here to do this work. Yes, I made a mistake, but yes, I'm here to repair that, and let's get the work done.
Thank you. So we do have a few questions that have come in from the audience. The first one I'm going to ask is in response to something, Dorothy, that you had mentioned earlier when you were talking about, I think, kind of the motivations of the institutions for engaging in reparative work, and possibly the means in which they start to kind of exercise that as a process of maybe self-improvement, both at the individual level and possibly in even the institutional one. I'll read the comment or the question rather verbatim, and I'll give you, Dorothy, a chance to respond, but then please, the others on the panel, please feel free to chime in with your 2 cents as well. They say, what Dorothy brought up about how reparative work often still centers whiteness, how do we ensure a wider array or different voices and perspectives are centered in this work?
I think to go back to one of the earlier statements of sort of acknowledging the situation and its context that you're in at the moment. If your workplace is entirely homogenous, you might literally need to be bringing, I guess you won't literally be bringing in voices, but you might literally need to be bringing in other folks. But I think also, to me, it's not necessarily at that scale, because that can often feel like then that's a dead end. Like, well, okay, this is our staff. They're actually fantastic at their jobs. Much like Ngaire saying, it's not like, oh, this is the white supremacist person who ruins our work. Like, everyone is actually trying very hard to do the best work they can. But depending on the type of work you're doing, a lot of times I feel like, because there's such a focus on individual growth and on sort of Eurocentric or even just like American-centric current political climates, that people aren't able to use the skills they already have to expand the voices that are in that room. So if we're talking about something like interpretive language or descriptive language for objects writ large, a lot of times questions people bring to me about describing African-American materials, the answer I have that I have to phrase nicer, because I am not trying to be a negative person, is please pick up a history book. In the same way that you have done before when describing other materials. And I think that because there's all this baggage around, which is like very valid baggage, but there's all this baggage around race, that folks who are amazing at researching German apothecaries of the 19th century feel like there's a roadblock in reading a book about Reconstruction. Like, they don't, because I don't know about Black people. And it's like, great. Luckily, so many people have dedicated their lives to this. You can read books and get references. And for me, that is a way of bringing in those voices, and also just, again, acknowledging those limits. Like, I am often very straightforward in the context I'm working in, that I have, again, not a doctor of these topics, but I've dedicated a lot of my research time to African-American history. And then people often want to ask me then about Caribbean history, or about Asian American migration, or describing trans people. And those are all great topics that I have learned about, but I'm not an expert in. And my reflex is to either read things written by members of those communities about things like language. We have such a wealth of information. Or a lot of times to have networked and bring in a colleague who I know does that. Even once I was doing a workshop on reparative description, and it was a broad workshop, so I did cover many areas. And I got a question from someone I recognized as an early career archivist who I know to be Indigenous and trans, and they asked me about ascribing gender to historical figures in archives, which is very common when we're trying to make things accessible. You might say, unidentified woman, which is making, a pretty big assumption of that individual. And my first reflex was, what do you think about this? Like, I know I'm here teaching this. I would like you also to be in conversation with me because I know you have an opinion. And they gave their opinion, and I said, this is probably what I do, which could be wrong. And I think all of those sorts of things of, what do you think? Here's what I'm doing and why, but it might be very wrong, are ways that we can challenge the professionalism that Ngaire has talked about, that tells us that admitting that we might be wrong or that things we're doing might need to change over time as a fatal flaw, but also help bring in voices just in the way that you will learn more and have those voices in your mix. You will know from reading Out of the House of Bondage about the voices of Black women. And you will also, in fact, learn more about the voices of white women at the same time. But I think to me, that's always it, of like, what have you done to learn more about this? What have your first steps been?
Ngaire or Stacie, do you have any?
Yeah, I have an example for that too. And it goes back to, I guess, our earlier question where we talked about repair and regeneration. So, I mean, at our museum, we're in the process, and the Smithsonian as a whole, at looking at ethical returns. And so we're in the middle of the Benin Bronze's transfer of ownership. So there's been a fair amount of conversation and press about it. And I find it really interesting because when I speak about it, I really consider that, transferring ownership of the bronzes is part of our reparative work. But it's not really the mission of what we're doing. What we're busy trying to do is develop a 21st century global African art museum and create a space of, belonging that's of and for global Africans. And so I find it very interesting how much the conversation in certainly the Western media just sticks with the harm. And it sticks with the moment of violence. The conversation is about the theft of the objects, and is about, not even about the harm. It kind of centers the white colonialists, the Brits, in the whole conversation, because the moment of the bronzes are not really talked about what they represent and how much they've inspired other people and, their function within their context and their legacy now. Everything starts to be on that one moment of harm that tends to kind of, in a weird way, because I think harm is really important to acknowledge, which is what I said before, but I'm finding it very interesting, people's obsession of being unable to go beyond it. Like everyone just sits in that moment, and it's made me like white people of like self-flagellation, right? Like terrible, terrible colonization, mea culpa, like whatever. And I'm like, okay, yes, let's fix this. Let's address this. Let's not negate it. Let's acknowledge it. But also let's also talk about what we can do in terms of regeneration. And I think that those assumptions are really important. Another thing is really assuming who we're talking to. In our museum, often the default is that audiences are white, right? And our audiences are just American. Our audiences are not like African immigrants or African Americans or part of the global diaspora. And so there's an assumption there that continues to center that whiteness that I think we have to really check ourselves in and move beyond in order to do the regenerative work.
That actually flows really nicely with another question that came in that Ngaire, I'd invite you to maybe add to your thoughts if you have them, and then also invite Stacie and Dorothy to reflect. I think just listening to you talk about the word regenerative in concert with reparative, the question is, we've used the word repair and reparative a lot in this session. Is the museum model something that can be repaired in the past tense? That's the question. And so I wonder if that connects to some of your ideas about, the broader ideas you're bringing to the table about it not just being about harm reduction. So do you have anything to add to that or to say to this individual?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know whether like harm is in our DNA in the museum model. I like to think it's not. And the way that I get around that question is I think of all the functions of museums are not, there is some kind of regenerative possibilities. So if you look at conservation, documentation, research, exhibition, public programs, if you kind of take down museums and you kind of parse them into their different parts, you see comparable institutions all over the world that are indigenous or African or, that are not part of a kind of Eurocentric, Euro-dominant way of dealing with the world. And so for me, those are the possibilities for, I guess, revolution. Or profound transformation. I don't know if it's possible, and we're certainly going to try, but I think it's an excellent question.
I have a question, possibly following up on that, but possibly a bit broader, and I asked Stacie, maybe you to respond for this first. I note that, and I'm not sure if this was by design, but each of you comes from a very different type of institution, or at least historically what we think of as, the public space and the private space. So Stacie, you're at a public library. Ngaire, you're at a publicly and privately funded museum, a government institution. Dorothy, you're at a private university institution. Stacie, starting with you, and because you actually introduced this idea, I think, earlier in your comments about coming to a public library. Do you think that this work differs based on those designations that we have around just the funding model and, what the mission perhaps, or the perceived mission, as Stacie, you started to bring up, I think, some of the challenges there and the way that's changed over time. Does it matter? Are we all doing the situational work that Dorothy, you've been talking about too, that highly specific contextual work? Or are these structures part of it? And is there a way to think about that in concert to our discussion here? So can I start with you, Stacie?
Sure. I think that's a great question. In general, yes, I think the work that we're all collectively talking about doing is the same. Maybe what I've simply come to understand at this point, because I've been in different institutions, and I've had things that I was able to implement in some, and then things that maybe I was able to get started in some, but then someone else had to follow up. So, I think, yeah, we do the best that we can in whatever our role is and what that situational power gives us. So when I very first started, I had a manager. That manager left at the end of last year. But what that manager was able to do was essentially establish our division. And that was a really, really big deal. That took a lot of work. That was not insignificant work. And it was, but one piece of helping pull things together, and a piece and a series or chains of decisions that were made across a group of people to say, this is necessary that we do this. The need for access to this information is so great. It's necessary to bring this together and standardize it. So she did that. It was fantastic. And now she's gone. So I'm sort of looking at my role like, all right, what are the next steps that I can do situationally in my lane? So, that looks like a lot of, I think, administrative bricklaying, making sure that the things that we want to say standard are actually documented in central locations that the staff in the division and senior staff can see, so that there is continuity. I think at a public institution, folks, just because with city jobs and how they are, folks might stay for a longer period of time. And there's always that danger of, someone retires and 30 years of knowledge gets up and walks out of the door when those folks leave. So this is what I'm doing in my lane. I am a human being, flesh and blood, so I'm not going to live forever. So that means someone else has to come behind me and also, they will then pick up what's what's the rest of the work that needs to be done? So, you know, again, I think everybody is on point about staying in your lane and thinking through what is in your mode of power to make better decisions, so that when the work has to be picked up behind you, you've left something better than you found it.
Well, I had posed that question with the hope that perhaps we could get some more voices in, but now I'm actually looking at the clock and realizing that Stacie, you had the final word on that. But I think that's actually a great way to end this session and what we've been discussing. I really want to thank each of you for your contributions and your time today. I learned a lot, and in fact, it was so difficult for me to both moderate and listen at the same time that I actually plan to rewatch this session at a later date so that I can get the full benefit of your wisdom. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who chimed in on the phone with your questions and comments as well.
Thank you.